I can't believe this is my first video talking about Spanish, but here we are. I'm one of those rare cases who didn't take Spanish in high school. What do you want from me? I have family in France. Anyway, I half-heartedly studied a little Spanish about a decade ago when I worked for a large language learning software company named after a historical artifact written in 3 scripts and 2 languages, neither of which they teach. And that was really just because I was leaving a lot of money on the table when I worked on commission, because people would walk up and say, "Hablo usted español?" And I'd be like, and they would take their money elsewhere. But when I was like, "Sí, un poquito, estoy aprendiendo con este software, ¿le puedo ayudar?" they would buy the software. But my heart wasn't in it, and I'm basically the only person in the linguistics and language learning space, especially on YouTube, who doesn't really speak Spanish. To the point that I tried to use Spanish as an example in a video and instead just used imagined romance I dredged up from my subconscious, mixing French, Italian, Portuguese, and straight up Latin, like some sort of Lovecraftian linguistic monstrosity. But now I really want to get down to it, and while I loathe the language in 3 months guys, Spanish is one that I think I could probably get comfortable with pretty quickly. So I'll tell you what I'm probably going to do, but more importantly, I'll tell you what I would do if I were starting fresh and didn't have a PhD in linguistics and familiarity with other Romance languages. Not only that, but I'll give options for both those willing to invest a little bit of money and for those only willing to invest time. I'm also building on the lessons learned from my 3 months studying Persian, during which I learned a lot, but I did not achieve my speaking goals. So I've revised my advice, especially around things like Anki. That reminds me, if you're new to the channel, welcome. I'm Dr. Taylor Jones. I have a PhD in linguistics from the University of Pennsylvania. I speak a handful of languages, and I think language and culture are endlessly interesting. Here on the channel, I try to share why that is, with an eye to both pointing out really weird and unexpected ways that languages work, and also answering the questions that people have about languages, language learning, and linguistics. And today, I'm finally giving in. We're going to learn Spanish. In fact, I might make a video in a few months for a before and after, or 7 days if I'm feeling squirrely. This is Language Jones. Today's video actually has a sponsor, which I thought long and hard about before agreeing to. You don't have to use them, and I'll talk about a wide variety of other methods in the rest of the video, but I am endorsing them because I've used their product, I've assessed it, and I believe it to be effective, and frankly, I found it tremendously fun. I specifically wrote into our agreement that I reserved the right to give an honest review, including any flaws and shortcomings, and they agreed. So today's video is sponsored by Lingoda. Lingoda is an online language school with 5 languages, and one of them is Spanish. They have a very thorough and well put together course that can get you from absolute beginner to C1 in some of the languages they offer. The basic idea is to create a space where you can start talking from day one, learning in small group and sometimes individual sessions with native speakers. They have a well-organized course that provides enough context and vocabulary for a jumping off point for conversations in your target language with teachers from around the world. I've used them for Spanish as a beginner and for French, where I took some of their B2 level content, and I was impressed with both. They offer different tracks, including an intensive sprint, which I believe Elise Speaks did before doing a C2 exam, and Flex, which is more my speed since planning around a toddler is hard. There's also teams with a more fixed class time with a guaranteed completion of a sublevel in 8 to 12 weeks. Learning a language can be hard, and I really appreciate that they recognize that and try to take the hard work out of it. I promised I'd talk downsides too, so most of them are on our end as learners. I found it hard to make the time to consistently study with them for an hour at a time, especially to prioritize Spanish. While I do have difficulty scheduling because I have a toddler, they do have classes 24/7. So even if it's hard to find time, you can find the time. Maybe at like 3 a.m. The only real criticism I can give from what I've seen so far is that I once had a Chilean tutor with them who said Spanish words always have a higher pitch on the stressed syllable, like Spanish has pitch accent or something. Turns out Chilean Spanish kind of does. But it's an outlier there. And the learners, I'm sure, will go on to work with other teachers from around the world, so it could be confusing at first, but they'll get the hang of it. And in case this wasn't clear, being exposed to accents like Chilean Spanish is going to be tremendously helpful in the long run, even if you don't want to go to Chile. So it's not free. It requires an investment of time and energy and a modicum of consistency. But you do really get your money's worth. If you feel like giving them a shot, click my link, or use my code JONES20 for up to 20 euros or equivalent off and up to 20 private classes when you sign up for Flex. Okay, so back to the video. Whether you use Lingoda or not, here's what I would do. First, I'm going to assume you're starting from scratch. You know the saying, "This isn't my first rodeo"? Well, Spanish is often people's first rodeo. And for most English speakers, that means you have to learn the basics of grammar while learning a different language, because most of us don't learn grammar in school, or didn't pay attention. This might even be your first time learning about language, capital L. So a few things are really important to know going into this. But first, a bit of a roadmap. We're going to need to understand the sounds of Spanish, the structure of Spanish, how to memorize, how to practice improvising, and where to find interesting things in Spanish. Otherwise, why are we even learning it? First, languages are both practically infinite, with more words than you could ever hope to learn, and an infinite generative capacity to say new and interesting things, and also, simultaneously, finite. I've talked about the ideas behind generative linguistics before, but the takeaway for this is that we do all the infinite stuff with a handful of building blocks. But the building blocks of Spanish are put together a little different than English. The building blocks of any language are the sounds, the phonological inventory, and how they go together, and then the pieces of words, morphemes, and then the words in bigger structures like phrases and sentences. Historically, it would have been really important to me to sound authentic, auténtico, whatever that means, and I would have wanted to imitate an accent I thought people would respect. Don't get me wrong, I don't want a thick English accent like Mike Bloomberg, but Spanish is a colonial language spoken by hundreds of millions of people, so there's a bewildering cornucopia of accents to choose from.
Por favor, empieza a movilizarse. Es muy peligroso quedarse en esta área y estará violando la ley. Por favor, protéjanse y tome precauciones.
At the end of the day, you just need to pick something and stick with it, and a generic, educated accent will be fine. I'll be doing a generic Latin American accent because I don't feel any need to go to Spain, and frankly, I doubt they'd want me there anyway. I'm honestly thinking of global Spanish as just shy of being a conlang at this point, kind of like English. I'm not going to fool anyone into thinking I'm from somewhere I'm not, and cool and local and all that, and honestly, any good spy, which I'm not, could tell you that it's better to speak well and be obviously a foreigner who speaks well than to be suspiciously too locally knowledgeable. So my initial goal is to just sound good with normal speech and communicate intelligently, not sound erudite and wow people with my impressive vocabulary and massive stock of synonyms. I need to recognize as much as possible, but that doesn't mean I have to talk all that mess. I'll be happy if I can do the equivalent of calling something a light blue, like the sky, or a bird's egg, not getting into the shades of difference between whether it was really a cornflower blue or a robin's egg, or maybe more of a cerulean and not a lapis. Same goes for basically everything. There's a rich vocabulary of emotions and colors that I'll need to recognize, but frankly, I don't even use in English. Leave me a comment, by the way, with your favorite overly specific color term or emotion word, for the algorithm. For the phonology, I would just peruse Wikipedia. If you don't know the International Phonetic Alphabet, this is where a lot of listening practice comes in. As a linguist, I'll probably be slowing down audio in Audacity or even analyzing spectrograms in Prot. Both of these are free resources. Or, even more fun, just using my training and my ears. But if you're a regular person, maybe try something like shadowing, or recording yourself and comparing to someone you wouldn't mind sounding like every now and then. This means using the AI translation tool on Gilbert Gottfried's voice is probably a non-starter, unless you're into that kind of thing. All that talk about the finite nature of the generative tools of Spanish boils down to get a decent grammar. I have the Routledge Essential Grammars for a handful of languages, and I like them. I got the more comprehensive grammar for Spanish out of curiosity, and also because one of the authors is named Butt. When you have a name that kids in the playground will make fun of, I feel like it makes you a more thorough and serious scholar. This is not scientific, it's just a bias I have. But so far, I like Butt's big book. I cannot lie. It's just got a great explanation of the benefits and uses of the subjunctive that casts doubt on the whole "it's just about casting doubt" nonsense, and it frequently compares to French, which is great for me. I'm going to use Lingoda for my speaking and interacting, but you don't have to. There are quite a few online platforms, both paid and free, for speaking practice, some of which I've even endorsed on other videos. But a couple of decades of trying to learn a language without interacting with real people, and I can tell you with certainty, you need to interact with real people. You can't just disappear from social media for a month and come back fluent because you had an AI tutor. Language hacking is not a thing. Stop trying to make it a thing. It's not a thing. So here's the deal. So far, all of this is getting exposure, but exposure is not enough. I have to get the Spanish into my skull. So that means memorization. I've mentioned this elsewhere, and I'll probably do a full guide later, but memorization is its own entire subdiscipline in the science of learning. I'm going to need to consistently review words, both recognizing and producing, and the way I prefer to do that is with digital flashcards using the very advanced science of spaced repetition software. You can literally make a version out of SRS in a shoebox with real cards, so that last part was a joke. For this, I like Anki. In addition, it helps to memorize nouns with their genders, it helps to use images where possible, and it helps to make everything as memorable as possible. I hate that this is true, but mnemonics actually work. Also, tapping into your amygdala by using things that evoke sex, violence, fear, excitement, and so on also work. In practice, this means I'm partial to what I call naughty mnemonics, and that my Anki decks that have pictures are not ones I'd always do on the bus. I don't want to have to explain the random sexually suggestive or violent or scary pictures I use, despite the fact that I do keep it an absolutely hard PG-13 at the spiciest. We're trying to be polyglots, not polygoons. Right? Right? Anyway, one thing to remember is the recognition and production asymmetry. I can easily recognize that pájaro is bird, but I have a harder time actually producing the word, and an even harder time remembering that it's always masculine. And evidently an even harder time not aspirating that P. So when I see a card that says el pájaro, I can defer review of that much longer than the one that says bird. I'm not going to lie, I'm also going to be trying to speedrun as much of Duolingo as I can to see words in context. I'm even using the Duolingo Anki deck as my primary Anki deck, though I might make another based on this book that I like, the Ultimate Spanish Review and Practice. I'll link all the books in the description. I have the paid version of Duolingo. The unpaid just means that you'd better not make any mistakes. For Anki, my preferences are to use audio, to ensure that I have production cards where I actually have to generate the words I'm learning, and to memorize chunks, not just individual words, so two-word phrases, etc. Bigrams and trigrams, baby. When I was studying Persian, I tried to use close deletion on entire sentences. I found that doesn't work for me, especially when I went back to it and I realized that I had really no idea what was going on. And even worse is just translating full sentences back and forth. So at this point, I find I do better with individual words or couple of word phrases. On top of all of that, I plan to immerse myself in real-life Spanish materials, not actual immersion, without the expectation of understanding everything up front, but just as a way of attuning my ears to different accents, reinforcing the words and structures that I do know, and getting a few easy words from context. I have cable TV because I'm an old man, so I can watch Univision and so on, but I also have Netflix and YouTube and another sponsor that I sometimes mention that does a lot of TV and media stuff. You don't have to go the paid route, especially for a language like Spanish. And beyond TV, there's a lot of stuff like podcasts in Spanish. I can read Wikipedia on things that interest me, and the pop science magazine, Muy Interesante, tends to live up to its name. I definitely wouldn't recommend this approach for every language, but for English speakers learning something like Spanish, there is an embarrassment of riches. We are drowning in Spanish content. Some politicians would even say there's too much. I'm also setting myself a short time frame, since this is not necessarily my passion, and a goal. I'm going to make a video in Spanish in a few months. Lastly, I'm planning so that I can be consistent with the meat and potatoes of my study, Anki deck, basic vocab, and an understanding of the grammatical system. So let's summarize what I would recommend for anyone. Before we even talk about the process of learning, recognize that Spanish is spoken by hundreds of millions of people, so we can take some of the pressure off of ourselves. It's in the running for universal basic. Recognize that there's a lot of what I call freebies and be on the lookout for them. When first starting, start by making sure you have a decent grasp of the admittedly fairly simple phonology. Pick an accent, your resources are likely to do this for you, and don't worry about doing anything other than getting decent pronunciation so people understand you without struggling. Also, make sure you know where to get grammatical questions answered. I love a good grammar, but there's also tons of free resources on the internet. Pick a primary study resource. This can be a textbook, Duolingo, Rosetta Stone, or classes like with Lingoda. It could even be just mainlining YouTube videos, as one word at a time has shown can be effective in a few months. Then, don't just study to understand the concept and recognize the word, but actually study to memorize. This is the hard one for me, so I use Anki. Any spaced repetition software or spaced repetition shoebox will do. Lockbox.
A lockbox.
Be consistent in the primary study and, even more importantly, primary memorization approach. In addition, look for fun things in the language and engage with content that's interesting for you. Podcasts, TV, movies, Wikipedia, and other print media. This should be your new habit. Scrolling on your phone? Scroll in Spanish. But also, you can live your life without having to do this all Spanish all the time. That's basically it, and that's what I'm gonna do. As with most things in life, the more money you have to throw at the problem, the easier things are. I definitely recommend Lingoda, some grammar books, and various subscriptions. However, if you're on a shoestring budget, I'll guess that since you're watching this, you have internet access. In that case, YouTube videos, Anki on a desktop pulling audio from Forvo and images from Google, and not the paid version of Anki for your phone, the free versions of Duolingo, but be careful about your mistakes, and a willingness to snatch up whatever Spanish language content you can find online for free should still do the trick, especially if you're furiously Googling things like order of pronouns in Spanish, as I did recently. So let's do this. I'll come back in a few months and we can all see how I did. We can see how you did. And I'll link that video in the description here. And if you're learning Spanish, leave me a comment with which of these tips you think will help you the most. If you like what I'm doing with the channel, please like and subscribe and leave a comment. If you leave it in Spanish, I'll read it and respond in a few months. Check out some of my other videos, by the way. YouTube thinks that you'll like this one. If you'd like to support the channel, you can right here on YouTube with super thanks and super chat, or on Patreon at www.patreon.com/lenguajejones or lenguajejones. 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 Until next time.